You travel very much, I'm sure, in what you do. What do you see are the defining characteristics of Latin America, which is very different from Asia or other emerging markets? And I think that the error in terms of talking about BRIC in one sentence is Brazil is not China, it's not India, it's not Russia. It's very unique in its own way.
I think that Latin America has a completely different story when you compare to China. We were discovered by Columbus in the 16th century. So it's a very recent area of the world that has been developed. We are Christians, basically. Most of Latin America is Catholic, as Brazil. So this makes a lot of difference in terms of the way things, the way the country has been developed, and so on and so forth. When you come to markets, I think that in Latin America we have the banks are more national, they are not international. Most of the banks are very national, they are much more in their home countries, and they have not multi-presence around the area. Itaú probably is one of the local banks that has more international presence in the region, which is completely different from the countries in Asia, where you have many of the banks have different market positions in different countries. So I think this is one of the differences. But I would say that culturally are two very different areas of the world.
If the banks in Latin America are generally national, did the global economic crisis sort of make them to tend to become even more national? Do you see a tendency for regulators in Latin America to protect their market even more today than they used to?
This is another difference. This is a good point that you are raising, because Latin America are much more open financial markets than Asian markets.
Between countries?
We have presence of international banks all over Latin America.
Okay.
In Brazil, and any bank could go in Brazil and get a license and have branches and develop the business in Brazil freely in equal conditions to local banks.
And likewise in
no
Argentina?
Likewise, most of the
Chile?
countries in Latin America, Chile, Argentina, Mexico.
And this was the result of a previous crisis?
This was a result of reform in the financial system. We had crises in the 80s and 90s in most of the countries in Latin America, given the inflation, the debt crisis that Latin America went through in the 80s, the inflationary period of the early 90s. So all this led to crisis in the banking sector and the necessity to reformulate, to reorganize, redesign the financial sector.
How much of your own business comes from your home market? What percent?
90%.
90%, okay. So in your home market, who would your most important competitors be? Would it be the foreign banks in your home market?
No, the local bank, Bradesco is
Banesto, yes.
What
about Santander?
Santander is the biggest foreign bank in Brazil, especially after the acquisition of Banco Real, as I mentioned. But we have their Citibank, we have their HSBC, we have many international banks.
And in terms of the ability of these banks to compete in the domestic market, I mean, they would be theoretically better capitalized?
I would not say that in the case of Brazil. The Brazilian banks, either Itaú or Bradesco, are very well capitalized. They have a very good image in the country.
So being domestic is very important,
yes.
And being a local player is important.
I think we can focus on our local market, and we can understand better probably the whole market.
Now, how do you see the global relations of banks like Banco Itau with other non-Latin American countries evolving? You follow the trade, you follow the commodities value chain.
Yeah, in our case, we try to follow our big companies that are expanding out of Brazil. We are also very focused on the flow of capital into Brazil.
Okay.
So we have a securities house, ours, Itaú Securities, which has established in many areas of the world, Japan and Dubai and New York, so in many other areas. So we try to be a hub for investors that are interested in Brazil. And this has been increasing in the recent years.
Do you see a lot of flows from Asia into Brazil?
It's beginning. We are starting to have flows from Asia countries into Brazil. Although this is a very new thing, it's very recent. Brazil was completely out of the map for
China
Asian investors.
Would you say that Peru and Chile are closer to Asia than Brazil is?
Peru and Chile, they are countries that have, they are in South America, but they are in the Pacific area. So they are closer in that sense to Asia. They have more trade, and Brazil is on Atlantic area, so we are closer to Europe and Africa.
Right. Let's focus a little bit on your role as Vice Chairman of IIF and your activities. What is your sense of the representation of emerging market banks, institutions, in the reforms taking place today?
Well, the reforms that are being discussed is basically coming from as a result of the crisis. We have to change a few things. But the crisis was basically in OECD banks, not in emerging market banks.
Right.
So the reforms basically are focusing on problems that those banks have. And probably most of the emerging market banks does not have the kind of business that will be mostly affected by the reforms. Basically, the reforms that is being discussed will affect a lot the trading business, things, investment banking and global business, which are not really the business that emerging market banks do.
But on a global trade basis, would you agree that banks in Brazil and Latin America were equally affected by the slowdown in credit, the slowdown in liquidity on the global financial system?
Yes, Brazil was growing in a 6% rate just before September, and probably this year will be flat. So it's a big difference, and this is caused by the whole crisis worldwide. But Brazil will probably next year will be growing like 3 to 4%. So we are coming back probably more rapidly than other countries. But we suffered as a consequence of the crisis. The crisis did not start in Brazil, did not start in the emerging markets. The crisis was really started on those countries.
But in terms of the formula, is it simply a case of supply and demand in terms of demand from developed countries and supply from Brazil? What about the domestic demand?
Yes, well, as the economy slows down, the demand for credit slows down. This is a clear consequence. We are expecting, for instance, this year to have a loan growth on the market about 10% compared to 30% almost last year. So it's a big slowdown in demand for credit. Even so, I think the markets are working well, liquidity is in place, interest rates are coming down still in Brazil. We have a long tradition of very high level of interest rates, and rates are coming down. Stock market is coming back, so things are coming back very well.